The twin suns of Verethra scorched the crimson dunes of the shattered wastes, baking the air into a shimmering haze that warped the horizon like a fever dream. Dust devils spiraled lazily between the skeletal remains of ancient war machines, their rusted bones bleached white by centuries of relentless heat. Amidst this desolation, Corporal Yarrick Voss crouched behind the shattered flank of a downed Skyraker gunship, his breath ragged, his pulse hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His armor, once a proud cobalt blue, was now a patchwork of scorches, dents, and dried ichor, both alien and human. The battle had been a brutal, grinding meat grinder for 3 days straight, and Yarrick felt every second of it in his aching bones and the raw scrape of thirst in his throat. He risked a glance over the wreckage. 50 meters away, silhouetted against the blinding glare of the setting suns, stood the reason his heart hadn't just given out from exhaustion. Commander Lyra of the Azure Concord. She was an impossible vision carved from moonlight and fire. Her skin was the pale, luminous white of polished alabaster, untouched by the desert's grime, seeming to glow faintly even in the harsh daylight. Her hair, a cascade of vibrant, untamed crimson, tumbled past her shoulders like molten copper, catching the dying light in fiery strands. She moved with a lethal grace that belied the heavy, ornate armor she wore. Sleek plates of deep indigo interwoven with threads of silver that shimmered like captured starlight. It wasn't just her beauty that stole his breath. It was the sheer, terrifying competence radiating from her. Minutes ago, she'd single-handedly held off a flanking charge of Kthar shock troopers, her energy blades a blur of cobalt light, her movements a deadly dance that left only scorched sand and broken bodies in her wake. Yarrick had watched, mesmerized, as she dispatched her foes with chilling efficiency, her expression one of focused calm, utterly detached from the carnage. He'd seen her fight before, of course. She was legendary among the human auxiliaries, but up close in the raw intimacy of shared survival, the effect was overwhelming. His mind, fogged by fatigue and adrenaline, slipped its leash. For just a fleeting, treacherous second, his thoughts drifted away from the tactical nightmare of their situation. The dwindling ammo, the encroaching enemy patrols, the cracked visor on his helmet, and fixated purely on her. Not as a commander, not as an ally, but as a woman. He thought about the impossible smoothness of that white skin, the way the red hair would feel like silk against his calloused hands, the curve of her jaw beneath the armor's high collar, the startling contrast of her emerald green eyes against her pale features. It was a stupid, human, utterly inappropriate thought in the middle of a battlefield where death was a constant companion. He pictured her without the armor, just for a heartbeat, a vision of ethereal beauty stark against the brutal backdrop of war. He didn't voice it, didn't even sigh. It was just a silent, internal flicker of pure, unguarded admiration mixed with a desperate, lonely longing. He didn't see her head snap around. He didn't hear the subtle shift in the desert wind that carried the faintest hum of her biosensors. But he felt it, a sudden, intense pressure, like the air itself had frozen solid. The hairs on his neck stood rigid. Slowly, dread coiling in his gut like a cold serpent, he turned his head. Lyra was staring directly at him, not scanning the perimeter, not assessing the enemy positions. Her full, unnerving attention was locked onto his face, visible through his cracked visor. Her emerald eyes, usually so cool and calculating, were wide, pupils dilated. But it wasn't anger he saw first. It was shock, profound, utter shock, as if he'd just spoken the most impossible, blasphemous thing aloud. Her lips parted slightly, a tiny, almost imperceptible gasp escaping her. Then the shock ignited. Her cheeks, usually so pale, flushed a deep, vibrant rose that spread down her neck, clashing beautifully with her crimson hair. Her eyes narrowed, not with fury, but with a flustered, almost panicked intensity. She took a half-step back, her hand instinctively flying to the hilt of one of her energy blades, not in threat, but as if seeking an anchor. Yarrick's blood ran cold. She heard it. The impossible thought slammed into him. She heard my thoughts. Panic, sharp and acidic, flooded his mouth. He'd heard rumors, of course, whispers among the veterans about the Concord's advanced neural tech, their rumored empathic or even telepathic sensitivities, especially among their elite commanders. He'd always dismissed it as battlefield superstition, the kind of stories told around campfires to scare new recruits. But the look on Lyra's face, it was undeniable. She hadn't just guessed. She'd felt it. The raw, unfiltered image of her body, stripped of context, stripped of respect, just there in his mind. Mortification burned through him, hotter than the Verethran suns. He wanted to vanish into the sand, to apologize, to explain it was just exhaustion, just the stupid, lonely brain of a soldier clinging to beauty in a place defined by ugliness. But words died in his throat. What could he possibly say? Sorry, I thought you were gorgeous while we were being shot at? Before he could formulate any coherent thought beyond sheer terror, the desert erupted. A guttural roar, more vibration than sound, tore through the air. From a nearby dune crest, 3 hulking Cthar brutes surged forward, their chitinous carapaces glistening with oily sweat, massive plasma cannons roaring to life on their shoulders. They'd been lying in wait, using the distraction of Lyra's momentary lapse to close the distance. Crimson energy bolts sizzled through the air, impacting the Skyraker wreckage with explosive force, showering Yarrick in molten shrapnel and superheated sand. Instinct took over. Yarrick rolled sideways, his rifle snapping up, firing controlled bursts at the lead brute's joint seals. The heavy rounds sparked harmlessly off its thick hide. Useless. He needed heavier firepower, but his grenade launcher was empty. He glanced desperately towards Lyra, expecting her to be already a blur of motion, cutting down the attackers. Instead, she was still frozen for a split second longer, her gaze flicking between him and the charging monsters, that same flustered, almost wounded expression warring with her ingrained warrior's discipline. It was the most human he'd ever seen her, and it terrified him more than the brutes. Then, with a sharp intake of breath that sounded almost like a sob, she moved, not with her usual fluid grace, but with a sudden, almost violent burst of speed. She didn't go for the brutes first. In a streak of indigo and silver, she covered the distance between them in less than a heartbeat. Her hand, clad in a gauntlet that hummed with contained energy, shot out and grabbed the front of Jarrek's armor, yanking him bodily off the ground just as a plasma bolt vaporized the spot where he'd been crouching. He stumbled, crashing into her, the cool metal of her armor pressing against his chest plate. He could smell the faint, clean scent of ozone and something floral, utterly alien, cutting through the stench of cordite and blood. "Stay behind me, Corporal." Her voice was low, tight with a tension he'd never heard before. Not just battle focus, but something else, something raw and strained. It wasn't a command. It was a plea wrapped in steel. She shoved him roughly towards the relative cover of the Skyraker's engine nacelle, her emerald eyes blazing with a complex storm of emotions: embarrassment, fury, protectiveness, and something that looked dangerously like hurt. Then she whirled, her energy blades igniting with a sharp crack hiss that split the air. What followed was a whirlwind of controlled fury. Lyra became a vortex of destruction. She met the first brute head-on, ducking under a clumsy swipe of its clawed fist, her blades carving deep, smoking gashes across its armored legs. The second brute fired its cannon. She leaped impossibly high, twisting in midair to avoid the searing beam, landing on its back and driving both blades deep into the vulnerable joint between its neck and carapace. The third brute, smarter, tried to flank her, but Lyra was already moving, using the dying brute as a springboard, launching herself towards it. Her movements were faster, more aggressive than Yarrick had ever seen, almost reckless. She wasn't just fighting. She was venting. Each strike was punctuated by a sharp exhale, her crimson hair whipping around her face like a banner of pure, focused rage. She dispatched the third brute with a brutal, efficient slash across its throat mandibles, silencing its guttural cries. Silence fell again, heavier than before, broken only by the crackle of dying plasma and the ragged sound of Jarrek's own breathing. Lyra stood amidst the steaming corpses, her blades retracting with a soft shink. She didn't turn to look at him immediately. Her shoulders were heaving slightly, not from exertion. She was far too conditioned for that, but from something deeper. When she finally did turn, the flush was still high on her cheeks, but her expression was carefully schooled back into its usual cool mask. Yet, her eyes still held that flicker of vulnerability, that wounded confusion. She strode towards him, her boots crunching on the scorched sand. Yarrick braced himself for a reprimand, a demotion, maybe even a court-martial for insubordination or whatever mental trespass he'd committed. He opened his mouth to stammer an apology, anything to bridge the chasm of awkwardness and danger that now yawned between them. "Your helmet visor is compromised, Corporal Voss," she stated. Her voice clipped, professional, but lacking its usual icy detachment, sounded strained. "It offers negligible protection against plasma splash or neural scans." She reached out, not towards his face, but to the side of his helmet, her fingers deftly working the release catch. The helmet hissed open, lifting away. The sudden rush of hot, dry air was a shock. He blinked, squinting in the harsh light, suddenly feeling horribly exposed, not just physically, but mentally. He could feel the heat of her gaze on his face, searching. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as the dunes. "Commander, I didn't mean, it was just..." He trailed off, unable to articulate the stupid, fleeting thought that had caused this entire mess. How do you explain a moment of human weakness to a being who seemed carved from starlight and discipline? Lyra's gaze dropped for a fraction of a second, then snapped back up, her emerald eyes locking onto his. The professional mask wavered. "Do you have any idea?" she began, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying perfectly in the stillness. "What it is like to feel the weight of such thoughts, unbidden, unfiltered, like a physical touch you cannot brush away." There was no accusation in her tone, only a profound, weary sadness, and a flicker of something else, curiosity. "On my world, such intrusions are considered the deepest violation, a stripping of dignity." She paused, her chest rising and falling. "And yet, you were thinking of me as gorgeous?" The word sounded strange in her precise accent, almost foreign. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through her hand, still resting near his helmet release. Yarrick felt his own face burn. He couldn't lie. "Yes, Commander," he admitted, his voice rough. "In the middle of all this, you're the only beautiful thing I've seen in weeks, maybe months. It wasn't meant to disrespect you. It was just truth. Stupid, human truth." He met her gaze, forcing himself not to look away, despite the shame. "I'm sorry, truly." Lyra studied him for a long moment. The twin suns dipped lower, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the battlefield. The air hummed with the distant thrum of enemy skiffs searching the wastes. The immediate threat was gone, but the larger battle raged on. Her expression softened, just a fraction. The rigid line of her jaw relaxed. The sadness in her eyes didn't vanish, but it was joined by something else. A dawning understanding, perhaps, or even a reluctant amusement. A tiny, almost invisible quirk touched the corner of her lips. "Stupid human truth," she echoed softly. She shook her head, a single slow movement that sent her crimson hair swaying. "Your species is endlessly perplexing, Yarrick Voss." She used his first name. It sent a jolt through him. To find beauty in the heart of such ugliness. She gestured vaguely at the carnage around them. "And to be so open with it, even in your silence." She took a step closer, her white skin seeming to absorb the last of the sun's light. "On Verithra, beauty is a weapon, a shield, a carefully constructed facade. To be seen, truly seen, without the armor of expectation." She trailed off, her gaze drifting towards the horizon where enemy lights flickered. "It is disarming." Before Yarrick could process this unexpected vulnerability, a sharp, high-pitched whine cut through the air, the signature sound of Cthar-seeker drones. They were being hunted. Lyra's posture instantly snapped back to alertness. The moment of introspection shattered. But the connection, however fraught, had been made. She turned back to him, her emerald eyes sharp, but the earlier coldness was gone, replaced by a new intensity. "We cannot stay," she stated, her voice regaining its command tone, but laced with a new urgency that felt personal. "The main Concord force is regrouping at the Iron Oasis, 20 clicks northeast. We move now. Stay close. And Corporal." She paused, her gaze holding his for a heartbeat longer than necessary. "Try to keep your thoughts to yourself, at least until we're not actively being hunted by things that want to peel the flesh from our bones." There was a dryness in her tone, a hint of the humor he'd glimpsed beneath her stoicism. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it wasn't condemnation either. It was a truce, forged in shared peril and an awkward, undeniable spark. Yarrick nodded, scrambling to his feet, grabbing his rifle. As they moved out, weaving through the skeletal remains of the battlefield under the deepening violet twilight, the silence between them was different. It wasn't the silence of strangers or just comrades in arms. It was charged, thick with the unspoken. He was hyper-aware of her presence beside him, the faint hum of her armor, the way her crimson hair caught the last glimmers of light, the impossible pallor of her skin against the darkening dunes. He kept his mind carefully blank, focusing on the crunch of sand under his boots, the distant drone of enemy tech, the ache in his muscles. But the image of her, flushed and flustered, her emerald eyes wide with shock, was seared into his memory. And beneath the fear of the hunt, beneath the exhaustion of the endless war, a new, dangerous feeling began to unfurl in his chest. A fragile, terrifying hope. They navigated a narrow canyon, its walls striated with layers of rust-red rock that glowed faintly with residual geothermal energy. The seeker drone's whine grew louder, echoing off the cliffs. Lyra held up a fist, signaling a halt. She crouched, her sensors sweeping the canyon mouth. 2 drones. Standard patrol pattern. They'll sweep the entrance in 30 seconds. Her voice was a low murmur, close to his ear. He could feel the warmth radiating from her, a stark contrast to the cooling desert night. We need to disable them silently. My blades are too bright. Your rifle. Suppressors fried. Yarrick whispered back, his own voice tight. Last plasma bolt took it out. Lyra's eyes narrowed in thought. Then, a flicker of that dry humor returned. Of course it did. She glanced at him, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. Well, Corporal Voss, it seems your appreciation has landed us in a tight spot. Again. The jab was gentle, almost teasing. It wasn't blame. It was shared adversity. Distract them. Draw their fire towards that rock spire. She pointed to a jagged formation 50 meters ahead. I'll flank. When I signal, drop. Yarrick didn't hesitate. He broke cover, sprinting low and fast towards the spire, deliberately kicking up dust. Instantly, the high-pitched whine intensified, converging on his position. Crimson targeting lasers painted the sand around his feet. He dove behind the spire just as searing energy bolts slammed into the rock, showering him with hot fragments. He peeked out. The 2 disc-shaped drones hovered menacingly, their single red photoreceptors fixed on his position. Where was Lyra? A soft chime, almost musical, echoed from the canyon wall to his left. The signal. Yarrick dropped flat. 2 streaks of cobalt light, impossibly fast and silent, flashed through the air. There was a sharp crack, like ice shattering, and the whine cut off abruptly. The drones sputtered, sparks flying, and clattered to the ground, dark and dead. Lyra materialized from the shadows of the canyon wall, her blades retracting. She walked towards him, her expression unreadable in the gloom, but her movements less rigid than before. She offered him a hand up. He took it. Her grip was strong, calloused despite her ethereal appearance, and surprisingly warm. As he stood, their eyes met again in the dim light. The earlier awkwardness was still there, a thread woven into the fabric of their interaction, but it was no longer a barrier. It was a shared secret, a strange intimacy born of violation and survival. Your timing is adequate, Corporal, she said, releasing his hand, but not before he felt the briefest lingering pressure. For a human. High praise, Commander, Yarrick replied, a tentative smile touching his own lips. The tension in his shoulders eased, just a fraction. They weren't just surviving the desert anymore. They were navigating something far more complex, far more dangerous than Cthar brutes or seeker drones. They were navigating the treacherous, uncharted territory between 2 worlds, 2 species, sparked by a single stupid human thought about the impossible beauty of a white-skinned, red-haired alien woman in the heart of a desert battlefield. And as they turned to continue their desperate journey towards the Iron Oasis, the vast, indifferent stars of Verethra beginning to pierce the violet sky, Yarrick knew one thing with absolute certainty. The battle for survival had just become infinitely more complicated and infinitely more compelling. The desert stretched before them, vast and deadly, but the real challenge, the real, terrifying, exhilarating unknown, walked silently beside him, her crimson hair a beacon in the gathering dark. The Iron Oasis wasn't an oasis at all. Not in any human sense. It was a jagged scar in the planet's crust. A geothermal vent where superheated steam hissed from fissures in the black rock, condensing into a perpetual, shimmering fog that clung to the ground like a living thing. Strange, bioluminescent fungi clung to the canyon walls, casting an eerie blue-green glow that turned the mist into a shifting, spectral veil. The air smelled of sulfur, ozone, and something metallic, blood, perhaps, or the residue of ancient Concord weapons. This was where the remnants of the Azure Concord's third wing had regrouped, a desperate pocket of resistance against the Cthar swarm that had overrun the northern continent. Yarrick and Lyra slipped through the steam like ghosts, their movements silent, their senses straining. The temporary truce forged in the canyon had deepened into a wary, wordless understanding. They didn't speak of the thought, of the flush on her cheeks or the shame in his eyes. But it hung between them, not as a wound, but as a thread thin, fragile, yet undeniable. He noticed how she'd subtly position herself between him and potential threats, how her gaze would flick to him during lulls in the ambient noise, as if checking he was still there. She, in turn, seemed less rigid, her movements losing some of their machine-like precision, gaining a hint of something softer, something almost human. They found the Concord camp nestled in a natural amphitheater of black rock. Dozens of Lyra's kin, tall, elegant figures with skin tones ranging from moon-pale to deep violet, hair in shades of silver, white, and crimson, moved with quiet efficiency. Wounded were tended to under glowing med tents woven from bioluminescent fibers. Weapons were being recalibrated, armor patched with shimmering nanite paste. The mood was grim but focused. Hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. Survival was the only currency. Lyra was immediately summoned to the command nexus. A raised dais where Elder Valen, her mentor and the wing strategist, stood hunched over a holographic map that flickered with red Cthar incursions. Valen was ancient, his white hair braided with threads of gold, his face a roadmap of old battles, his eyes sharp as obsidian shards. He barely acknowledged Jarek's presence. His gaze fixed on Lyra with an intensity that made Jarek's skin prickle. "Commander." Valen's voice was like dry leaves scraping stone. "Your patrol was compromised. 3 brutes, 2 seekers. Unacceptable losses for a reconnaissance sweep." His eyes narrowed, flicking almost imperceptibly toward Jarek. "Especially with a human auxiliary attached." Lyra stood straight, her expression unreadable, but Jarek saw the slight tightening of her jaw. "The compromise was unforeseen, Elder. The Cthar adapted their tactics. We neutralized the threat." "Unforeseen?" Valen's voice dropped, laced with cold suspicion. "Or was it a lapse in discipline? I felt the disturbance in your neural resonance, Lyra. A spike of emotional static. Uncharacteristic. Dangerous." His obsidian eyes locked onto hers, probing. "What happened out there?" Jarek's blood ran cold. Neural resonance. So the rumors were true. The Concord didn't just have empathic tech. Their commanders were linked on a deeper level, able to sense each other's emotional states, perhaps even fragments of thought. Valen hadn't just heard about Jarek's slip. He'd felt its echo through Lyra. Lyra didn't flinch. "A momentary tactical surprise, Elder. It will not happen again." Her voice was steady, but Jarek saw the faintest tremor in her hand, clenched at her side. She was lying. For him. Valen studied her for a long, tense moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, he turned back to the map. "See that it doesn't. We have no room for distractions. The Cthar are converging on the ventral core. If they breach it, they gain control of the planet's geothermal network. Verithra falls." He pointed to a pulsing red icon deep within the hologram. "We launch a counterstrike at dawn. You will lead the infiltration team, Lyra. And you?" His gaze finally settled on Jarek, cold and dismissive. "Will remain here. Your skills are not suited for this operation." Jarek's stomach dropped. Being left behind wasn't just an insult. It was a death sentence. The camp was a target. And worse, it meant separation from Lyra. He opened his mouth to protest, but Lyra spoke first. "Elder, with respect," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Corporal Voss's knowledge of Cthar plasma conduit vulnerabilities is critical. He identified the weak point in their brute armor during our last engagement. His presence on the team increases our chances of success by 37.2%. The statistic hung in the air, precise, undeniable. Valen's eyes narrowed again, this time with something like grudging calculation. He looked from Lyra to Jarek and back. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Very well, but he stays under your direct command, Lyra. His life is your responsibility. Do not let sentiment cloud your judgment." The word sentiment was a blade, sharp and deliberate. Lyra inclined her head. "Understood, Elder." As they turned to leave the command dais, Jarek caught the faintest brush of her fingers against his armored forearm. A fleeting touch, gone in an instant, but it sent a jolt through him. It wasn't just reassurance. It was solidarity. She'd defied her elder for him. The hours until dawn were a blur of preparation. Yarrick was issued a new helmet with a functional visor and a Concord-issue pulse rifle that felt alien in his hands but hummed with terrifying power. He watched Lyra brief her team, elite warriors with faces like carved marble, their movements synchronized, their loyalty to her absolute. She was in her element now, the flustered woman of the dunes replaced by the legendary commander Lyra, cool, decisive, radiating authority. Yet, when her eyes met his during the briefing, there was a flicker of that shared understanding, a private acknowledgement beneath the professional facade. The infiltration began under cover of the planet's deepest night, when the twin moons were swallowed by Verethra's rings, casting the world into near-total darkness. They moved like shadows through the labyrinthine tunnels leading to the ventral core, ancient lava tubes repurposed by the Cthar into a fortress. The air grew hotter, thicker, smelling of molten rock and the acrid stench of Cthar biomechanics. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant clang of machinery and the skittering of unseen things. They reached the outer chamber of the core, a vast, cavernous space dominated by a colossal, throbbing geothermal tap, a structure of black metal and pulsating organic conduits that glowed with sickly green light. Cthar warriors patrolled in disciplined pairs, their chitinous forms moving with insectal precision. The plan was clear: disable the primary conduit regulator at the heart of the tap, causing a controlled overload that would cripple the Cthar's control without triggering a planet-wide eruption. Lyra signaled the attack. Her team moved with lethal grace, silent takedowns eliminating the perimeter guards. Yarrick followed Lyra towards the central regulator, his pulse rifle ready. They were halfway across the cavern when disaster struck. A hidden pressure plate, missed in their scans, triggered beneath Yarrick's boot. A klaxon blared, shattering the silence, and crimson emergency lights bathed the cavern in hellish light. Ambush! Lyra's voice cut through the chaos, sharp as her blades. From hidden alcoves in the cavern walls, dozens of Cthar warriors poured forth, not the standard infantry, but elite Praetorians, larger, faster, their carapaces reinforced with scavenged Concord armor plating. Worse, at their head strode a figure that made Lyra freeze mid-stride. It was another Concord commander, but where Lyra's armor was indigo and silver, his was black as void, shot through with veins of angry red light. His skin was the same pale white, but his hair was stark white, not red, and his eyes burned with a cold, fanatical hatred. Kalen, Lyra's former betrothed, a traitor who had defected to the Cthar, seduced by their promise of ultimate power, their vision of a galaxy purged of weakness, including, apparently, the sentimental leadership of the Azure Concord. Lyra. Kalen's voice was a silken sneer, amplified by his helmet. Still playing nursemaid to the primitives? How quaint. His gaze swept over Yarrick with utter contempt. I felt your little distraction. All the way from the command spire. Pathetic. Is this what has weakened your focus? A human's clumsy lust. Lyra's face went deathly pale, but her voice was ice. Kalen, your betrayal ends here. Betrayal? Kalen laughed. A harsh, grating sound. I embraced evolution. The Cthar offer strength, purity. They see the rot in our old ways, the weakness of empathy, the folly of protecting lesser species. He raised a hand, and the Praetorians surged forward. Kill them. Bring me the human. I want to show Lyra what happens to pets who overstep. Chaos erupted. Lyra's team engaged the Praetorians, their energy blades clashing against chitinous claws and reinforced armor. Yarrick fired his pulse rifle, the concussive blast staggering the Cthar, but they kept coming. He saw Lyra engage Kalen, their blades meeting in a shower of sparks, a whirlwind of indigo and black light. Kalen was faster, stronger, fueled by his fanaticism. He drove Lyra back, his blows relentless, taunting her. Remember our vows, Lyra? He hissed, parrying her desperate strike. You promised strength, but you chose this. He gestured contemptuously toward Yarrick, who was desperately holding off two Praetorians near the regulator console. You chose weakness, sentiment. It will be your undoing. Yarrick saw Lyra falter, a flicker of pain crossing her face. Not physical, but emotional. Kalen was striking at her deepest wound, her perceived failure, her weakness in protecting him. In that moment of hesitation, Kalen disarmed her with a brutal twist, sending her energy blades clattering to the floor. He pressed his own blade to her throat, his red-lit eyes gleaming with triumph. Now, human, Kalen barked. Drop your weapon, or I peel the skin from her face. Yarrick froze, his rifle aimed at Kalen, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw the fear in Lyra's emerald eyes, not for herself, but for him. She gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. Don't. Kalen smiled, a cruel, predatory thing. Ah, she doesn't want you to save her. How noble. But you will. Because if you don't, I'll make her watch as I dissect you piece by piece. Slowly, Yarrick's mind raced. Surrender meant death for both of them. Fighting meant Lyra's immediate death. There had to be another way. His eyes darted to the regulator console behind him, its interface glowing with complex glyphs. He remembered Lyra's briefing. The primary failsafe is a manual override. Only Concord neural patterns can activate it, but a sustained high-energy pulse at the harmonic frequency of the core's resonance. He hadn't understood the science, but he remembered the location, the small, shielded port on the console side. It was a gamble, a stupid, desperate gamble. But it was all he had. He lowered his rifle slowly, making a show of compliance. Kalen's smile widened. Wise choice, primitive. As Yarrick took a step forward, seemingly to surrender, he suddenly dropped to one knee, swinging his rifle not at Kalen, but at the console. He jammed the barrel into the shielded port and fired on full automatic, pouring every joule of energy the weapon had left into the delicate machinery. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The console exploded in a shower of sparks and molten metal. The entire cavern shuddered violently. The massive geothermal tap groaned, a deep, subsonic roar building within it. The green light flared blindingly bright, then began to pulse erratically. Kalen staggered back from Lyra, momentarily stunned by the explosion and the sudden instability. Fool, you've triggered a full cascade. The whole chamber will. He didn't finish. The cavern floor buckled. A fissure ripped open between Kalen and Lyra, spewing superheated steam and molten rock. Kalen roared in fury, but the ground beneath him gave way, and he vanished into the chasm with a final, echoing curse. Yarrick! Lyra screamed, scrambling to her feet, her eyes wide with terror. Not for the collapsing cavern, but for him. The explosion had thrown Yarrick backward. He lay dazed near the edge of the fissure, the heat searing his armor. The cavern was coming apart. Rocks the size of skyrakers crashed down. The surviving Cthar and Concord warriors were fleeing for the exits. Lyra didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward him, dodging falling debris, her face set in grim determination. She reached him just as a massive slab of rock threatened to crush them both. With a strength that defied her slender frame, she hauled him to his feet, half dragging, half carrying him toward the nearest tunnel exit. They stumbled out of the collapsing cavern just as the entrance sealed behind them with a thunderous crash, burying the ventral core and Kalen under millions of tons of rock. They collapsed onto the cooler sand outside, gasping for breath, covered in dust and soot. The night air was suddenly sweet, clean. For a long moment, they just lay there, side by side, listening to the muffled roar of the dying core deep below. Then Lyra turned to him. Her white skin was smudged with grime, her crimson hair tangled, her armor scorched, but her emerald eyes shone with a fierce, unguarded light. You, she said, her voice trembling slightly, are the most recklessly, infuriatingly brave human I have ever encountered. She reached out, her hand hovering near his face, as if afraid to touch him. You could have died. Yarrick managed a weak grin, his body aching. Worth it, he rasped. To see the look on that traitor's face. A sound escaped her then. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. She shook her head, a genuine smile finally breaking through, warm and bright against the desert night. Stupid human truth, she murmured, echoing his words from the dunes. But their moment of respite was short-lived. A shadow fell over them. Elder Valen stood there, flanked by two of his most trusted warriors. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a new, unsettling intensity as they fixed on Yarrick. The core is secure, Valen stated, his voice devoid of relief. But the cost? His gaze lingered on Yarrick. The human triggered a cascade that could have destroyed us all. His actions were unpredictable, dangerous. Lyra pushed herself up, stepping protectively in front of Yarrick. His actions saved Verithra Elder. He saw a solution none of us did. Or he gambled with the planet's stability on a whim, Valen countered, his voice cold. His mind is a chaotic storm, Lyra. Unreadable, unpredictable. And now, he paused, his obsidian eyes boring into Yarrick. Now he carries something else. Yarrick felt a sudden, sharp pain in his temple, a strange pressure behind his eyes. He blinked, and for a fleeting second, the world seemed to shimmer. He saw flashes, not his own thoughts, but fragmented images. The cold stone of the Concord spire, the intricate patterns of Lyra's armor, the deep green of her eyes, her thoughts? Or was it just concussion? Valen's lips thinned into a grim line. The neural feedback from the core's overload, it has created a resonance echo in his mind. A temporary bridge. He looked at Lyra, his voice dropping to a warning whisper. Be careful, child. The line between protector and prisoner is thin when minds are entangled. And his chaos, it could unravel you. Before Lyra could respond, a new sound cut through the night. The deep, resonant thrum of Concord dropships descending from the stars. Reinforcements. Salvation. But as the ships landed, bathing the desert in their soft blue light, Yarrick felt the strange pressure in his head intensify. He looked at Lyra, and in that moment he didn't just see her. He felt the fierce protectiveness warring with her ingrained discipline, the lingering echo of his own thought about her beauty now tangled with her own complex feelings. Admiration, frustration, fear, and something deeper, warmer, that she couldn't yet name. And beneath it all, a chilling certainty. The battle for Verithra wasn't over, and the most dangerous frontier wasn't the desert or the Kthar. It was the uncharted territory opening up between their two minds, a connection forged in fire and folly, promising either salvation or ruin. The dropship's ramps lowered, but Yarrick knew, with a dread that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that stepping onto that ship wouldn't be an escape. It would be the beginning of a far more perilous journey, one where every thought, every feeling, might no longer be his own to keep. Weeks later, under the twin suns of a Verithra slowly healing from war, Yarrick stood not in scorched armor, but in simple Concord-woven robes the color of desert twilight. Before him, beneath an arch of glowing bioluminescent vines, Lyra waited, her white skin clean, her crimson hair braided with threads of silver and gold, her emerald eyes holding no trace of battle weariness, only warmth. The neural echo had faded, not as a curse, but as a bridge that had taught them to listen, not just with minds, but with hearts. Elder Valen, his suspicions softened by Lyra's unwavering choice and Yarrick's quiet courage, had granted his blessing. Around them, human and Concord allies stood together, no longer auxiliaries and commanders, but friends. As their hands clasped, a human's calloused grip meeting an alien's graceful strength, a single word passed between them, spoken aloud for all to hear, yet carrying the weight of everything unspoken, always. And in that moment, amidst the rebirth of a world, they found not just peace, but a love as vast and enduring as the stars above.